The distress beacon had been broadcasting for 6 hours before anyone bothered to investigate, and when Ellie Voss finally cut her shuttle's engines and drifted toward the wreckage of what had once been a Vectari ceremonial vessel, she understood immediately why no one else had come. Some signals were meant to be ignored. Some silences were meant to be kept. But Ellie had never been particularly good at reading the room, and she was even worse at following unspoken rules that nobody had bothered to write down. The ship was beautiful, even broken. It had the shape of a collapsed wing, all curved obsidian panels and bioluminescent filaments that pulsed faintly even now, even dying, like a heartbeat that refused to accept the diagnosis. It was tangled in the debris field around Kithra's fourth moon, a graveyard of mining rigs and decommissioned satellites that everyone in the outer system knew to avoid. Ellie knew it too. She came here anyway, because something in the beacon's frequency was wrong in a way that didn't fit any malfunction she had ever heard. It wasn't broken. It was desperate. She had no idea yet that the creature inside was not supposed to be alive. Not by Vectari law. Not by the terms of a ritual she had never heard of and could not have pronounced. Not by any reasonable calculation of survival odds in a hull that had lost atmospheric integrity 4 hours ago. But Ellie Voss had a habit of finding things that shouldn't exist, a fact that her crew aboard the research hauler Tess Meridian had cataloged with equal parts admiration and exhaustion over the past 3 years. She docked with a magnetic clamp and suited up without calling for backup, which was either brave or reckless depending on who you asked. She had stopped asking. What she found on the other side of that airlock would change everything, but not in the way she expected, and not because of what it was, because of what it chose to do next. Ellie had been doing deep field xenological research for the Intercolonial Science Directorate for 11 years, a career that had taken her to 14 inhabited systems, the ruins of 3 extinct civilizations, and one very uncomfortable diplomatic dinner where she had accidentally insulted a Kravan ambassador by accepting a second helping of food, which apparently signaled that she found the first portion inadequate. Xenology was supposed to be observation from a distance, study, classification. She was not supposed to get involved. She was definitely not supposed to make contact without a full cultural protocol brief, a translation matrix rated for the species in question, and a minimum 2-week quarantine window. She had broken all 3 rules before she even got the airlock open. The TES Meridian was a mid-range science hauler, technically civilian, but running on an intercolonial charter that gave her clearance in restricted zones, or at least enough clearance to delay the inevitable argument about whether she should be here. Her crew of 8 was currently anchored on the night side of Kithra, processing mineral sample data, which meant they were occupied, which meant no one was watching the comms feed, which meant Ellie had approximately 3 hours before anyone realized she was gone. She had learned to calculate these windows with the precision of someone who had used them often. She was 34 years old and had not spoken to her family in 2 years, not out of anger, but out of the particular kind of distance that grows between people when one of them keeps choosing the dark between stars over anything warm and familiar. She was not running away from something. She told herself this often enough that she mostly believed it. She was running toward things, toward questions, toward the spaces where the known world frayed at its edges and something genuinely new waited on the other side. She had no idea how new this was going to be. The airlock cycled with a groan that was more feeling than sound, a vibration that moved through the soles of her boots and up into her chest, and then the inner door opened, and the emergency lighting of the Vectari vessel bled through in deep violet and amber, and Ellie stepped inside and stopped moving entirely. The creature was in the center of the chamber, kneeling. She had seen Vectari in documentation files, in diplomatic footage, in the kind of carefully composed xenological imagery that captured everything physically accurate and nothing emotionally true. They were tall. This one was nearly 2.5 meters, with a build that was dense and angular, exoskeletal ridges running from the crown of the skull down along the spine and outer forearms, skin the color of storm clouds backlit by lightning. 4 eyes, arranged in a slight arc, currently closed. The hands were pressed flat against the floor, palms down, fingers spread in a posture that the documentation files would have described as submissive or ritualistic. The documentation files would have been wrong. The creature was shaking, not from fear, from something worse, from the effort of holding still when every instinct was screaming otherwise. There were deep lacerations along its left shoulder and the upper section of its chest plate, the kind of wounds that spoke of a collision with something unforgiving at high velocity. The bioluminescent filaments that ran beneath Vectari's skin, a secondary nervous network, Ellie knew from her files, were flickering irregularly along its neck and jaw, which in biological terms meant its system was trying to manage trauma. In human terms, it meant it was in agony. And still it was kneeling. Still it was holding that posture, that impossible discipline, hands flat on the floor of a dying ship in a debris field in the middle of nowhere, maintaining a ritual position in a vessel that had maybe 40 minutes of residual atmosphere left. Ellie did not think. This was both her greatest flaw and her most essential quality. She crossed the chamber, dropped to one knee directly in front of it, and said, "Hey, I'm going to help you, okay? Can you hear me?" All four eyes opened at once. The sound that came from the Vectari was not something her translation matrix could parse. Not language, not yet. More like a frequency that her bones recognized before her brain did. Something between a warning and a question. It scrambled backward across the floor with a speed that was extraordinary given its injuries, putting its back to the far wall of the chamber, chest heaving, all four eyes fixed on her with an intensity that she would have described as terror, if terror were a thing she could imagine a Vectari experiencing. She raised both hands, palms out. "I'm not armed. I'm not military. I'm a scientist. My name is Ellie." The Matrix rendered her words into a rough approximation of Vectari standard. She could hear it translating in her earpiece, the syllables flattened and reordered. The creature's eyes tracked the sound. Something in its posture shifted, fractionally, the way a coiled spring might release exactly 1 millimeter of tension while still holding everything else tight. It said something. The Matrix took 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than normal. "You should not be here," it rendered. "This vessel is claimed. This ritual is closed. Your presence is a violation of Vectari's sacred protocol, and you will be—" It stopped. Not because it had finished, because the effort of speaking had cost it something it didn't have left to spend, and it pressed its back harder against the wall, and its four eyes went briefly unfocused, in a way that told Ellie it was about to lose consciousness. She moved before she decided to move. It was a habit, a flaw, an essential quality. She was across the chamber in seconds, her emergency medkit already in her hands, running a quick bioscan even though she knew perfectly well that the Vectari-specific settings on a civilian medkit were rated for basic triage at best. The scanner beeped and returned numbers she partially understood and partially improvised around. "I need you to stay awake," she said. "Just stay with me. Can you do that?" The alien looked at her with all four eyes and said something the Matrix rendered as, "Why do you speak to me as though I am worth saving?" Something in Ellie's chest went very still. She had read about Vectari culture. She had read the xenological summaries, the diplomatic briefings, the academic papers on their social hierarchy, and the trials of worthiness, the ancient ritual system that determined a Vectari's caste and function and essential value in the eyes of their civilization. She had read about it the way you read about something that happened to other people in other places. But this was not an abstract concept. This was a 2.5-meter being who was bleeding out on the floor of a broken ship, looking at her with four eyes that held a devastation so complete it had moved past despair into something quieter and more terrible, asking why it deserved to be saved in a tone that suggested it already knew the answer and had accepted it and was only asking to confirm. She looked at the creature and said, "Because you're breathing, that's enough." She applied the biofoam to the lacerations without asking for permission, because asking felt, in that moment, like cruelty dressed up as courtesy. It would take time for the foam to bond across a Vectari exoskeletal surface. The density differential was significant, but it would buy time, and time was what they needed. The creature did not pull away. It watched her work with an expression she could not read yet, and would spend the next several hours learning. Its name, the name it eventually gave her, after she had transferred it to the Meridian's medical bay and her crew had gone through the cycle of shock and objection and grudging acceptance that characterized their response to most of her decisions, was Corvin. More specifically, it was Corvin Dathel Os, third son of the household of Os, which was apparently a lineage of some significance in the Vectari hierarchy, though Corvin said this with a flatness that suggested significance and belonging were not the same thing. He was, and she had to recalibrate her understanding of Vectari gender signifiers on the fly, a ritual challenger. This was the term the Matrix gave her, though her xenologist brain immediately flagged it as a translation simplification. What Corvin actually was, in the full cultural context, was a being who had volunteered for something called the Vethkar, the trial of unbroken will, which was, as far as Ellie could piece together from Corvin's halting explanations and her own fragmented knowledge, a ritual combat and endurance test that no Vekthari entered unless they had either great courage or great desperation. Corvin, it became clear, had entered it for neither of those reasons. The Vethkar required a challenger to face the trial alone, to complete a set of tasks defined by the ritual council, and to return victorious or not at all. It was not, Corvin explained carefully, a ritual designed for survival. It was designed for proof. The distinction mattered to the Vekthari in ways that Ellie was only beginning to understand. The idea that worth was not given but demonstrated, and that the demonstration had to cost something real. What had gone wrong was not combat. It was not a predator or a rival or anything that would have made clean, comprehensible sense. It was a debris strike, a random piece of decommissioned mining equipment tumbling on an orbital path no one had calculated because no one lived here and no one was supposed to be here, had caught the ceremonial vessel broadside at the worst possible moment and torn the hull open in 3 places. The ritual had been violated by physics, and Corvin, bound by the laws of the Vethkar, had been unable to call for rescue, because calling for rescue was an admission of failure, and failure in the Vethkar did not mean losing the trial. It meant losing everything: caste, name, the right to be counted among the living in any meaningful Vekthari sense. This was why the beacon had been wrong. It had not been intentionally activated. It was an automatic emergency function of the vessel's dying systems, broadcasting against the wishes of the person it was trying to save. Ellie sat with this information in the Meridian's small medical bay, while Corvin lay on a surface they had hastily reconfigured, and she turned it over in her mind the way she turned over fragments of extinct civilizations, looking for the shape beneath the shape. "How long have you been in there?" she asked. 17 hours, Corvin said, "before the strike." "And after?" A long pause. "I do not know what day it is." She did not say what she was thinking, which was that he had been sitting in the posture she had found him in for 6 hours, holding a ritual position in a dying ship, refusing rescue because the law said refusing rescue was the only honorable choice. She did not say it because she was beginning to understand that saying it would accomplish nothing except to remind him of everything he had lost. She said instead, "Are you hungry?" He looked at her with all 4 eyes. The Matrix rendered his response as, "This is not a relevant question." "It is to me." She went to the galley and came back with the closest thing she had to a Vectari-compatible protein source, which was a compressed nutrient brick that her colleague Wade had brought aboard as a joke about field rations 3 months ago, and which had been sitting in the back of a supply cabinet ever since. She put it on the tray beside Corvin's temporary cot and said nothing about it. Corvin stared at the brick, then at her, then at the brick again. "You are offering me sustenance," he said, slowly, as though translating not words but the entire concept from one reality into another. "It's just food." "In my culture," he said, and there was something careful and fragile in the way he was assembling the words, "to offer sustenance to one who has failed a trial is... there is no precedent. The concept does not exist. The one who fails is... removed from the circle. They do not eat at the table of the living." "Well," Ellie said, "I'm not Vectari, so I don't have a table of the living. I just have a galley. And you're welcome there." She turned to leave him alone with it. He was not alone. What she didn't know yet, what came out later, in the slow, careful hours of a long hyperspace drift, while the Meridian carried them toward the nearest inhabited station, was that Corvin had entered the Vethkar not for glory, not for honor, but because of his brother. His brother, whose name he gave her in Vectari standard, and which the Matrix could not fully render, had died in a Vethkar trial 7 years ago. Had died, and in dying had brought a specific kind of shame to the household of Os. Not the shame of failure, which was clean and categorized, but the shame of doubt. There had been those in the ritual council who suggested, quietly and then less quietly, that the brother's death had not been the result of the trial's demands, but of his own insufficient preparation, his own insufficiency. Corvin had volunteered for the Vethkar to prove them wrong. Not to clear his brother's name in any formal sense, Vectari law did not operate that way, but to stand in the same trial and demonstrate by surviving it that the trial itself was survivable, and that what had taken his brother had been the trial at its most extreme, rather than any failure of the brother's nature. It was the most human thing Ellie had ever heard from a species not human. She told him this, and he was quiet for a long time. "Human," he finally said, with a cadence that the Matrix struggled with, something between a question and a classification. "You use this word to mean genuine, sincere. You believe sincerity is a property of your species alone. No, she said, startled. I didn't mean. You meant that what I described was relatable, that it resonated with you across the distance between our kinds. He paused. I understand. I was not offended. I was. Another long pause, and she watched the bioluminescent filaments along his neck pulse in a slow, rhythmic pattern she had begun to associate with processing, with searching for precision. I was moved by it, that you recognized it, that you named it. He would have wanted you to try, Ellie said quietly. He would have wanted me to succeed, Corvin said. There is a difference. He'd have wanted you to be alive to try again, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The crack happened quietly, the way real cracks always do. Not the dramatic fracture of something strong suddenly breaking, but the almost imperceptible shift of something held too long finally relaxing by a single degree. His breathing changed. The tension in his exoskeletal ridges, which had maintained a specific compressed angle since she'd found him, eased by something she could see only because she had been watching him for 16 hours. And then the Meridian's proximity alert fired. A Vectari patrol vessel had dropped out of transit exactly 12,000 kilometers from their position, broadcasting on a military frequency. And Ellie's comm officer, a sharp young man named Marcus, who handled surprises with the practiced composure of someone who worked for Ellie, came over the shipwide with a voice that was professionally calm and personally terrified. We've got a Vectari hierarchy military hail. They're asking if we have a ritual challenger aboard. They're asking nicely. Right now. Ellie looked at Corvin. His four eyes had gone flat, the particular flatness she now recognized not as blankness but as extreme control, the internal war running so hard that nothing was being allowed through to the surface. If they find me here, he said, the trial is forfeit. My presence on a foreign vessel is. It is an involuntary rescue. It is the end of everything I came here to do. They can't know you're here unless I tell them, she said. Ellie. He said her name, her actual name, for the first time, not the human or the researcher or any of the careful distances he had maintained. And the sound of it in his voice, in that strange low resonance that wasn't quite a human timbre, but was completely, devastatingly sincere, stopped her. They will scan the vessel, he said. They will find me. And then they will have evidence that you knowingly concealed a ritual challenger from hierarchy authority. That is not a small thing. You cannot protect me from this. Watch me, Ellie said, and went to the bridge. She opened the channel herself before Marcus could stop her, and she spoke to the patrol vessel's commanding officer, a Vectari in full military regalia, whose title the Matrix rendered as something between fleet commander and keeper of laws. And she did something that had not been done in the recorded history of human Vectari diplomatic relations. She cited the Vethkar. Specifically, she cited the provision, buried in the ritual codex that she had spent the last 6 hours reading on her personal tablet while Corvin slept, that allowed a challenger who had faced an unchosen interruption of the trial to petition the ritual council directly for a ruling on whether the trial's conditions had been materially violated. It was an obscure provision. It was not designed for situations involving other species, but it existed, and it applied, and the fleet commander could not dismiss it without violating the very ritual framework the patrol had been sent to enforce. The small carved stone Corvin wore around his neck, a piece of his brother's vessel, she had noticed it the first hour, dismissed it as ornamentation, and now understood completely. That stone, she realized, was the thing he had been trying to protect when she found him in that posture. Not himself. The piece of his brother. This was the thing she said to the fleet commander. Not as a legal argument, as a fact. The channel was silent for 47 seconds. Then the fleet commander said, in Vectari standard, that the Matrix rendered with unusual precision. A human knows the sacred provisions of the Vethkar. A human read for 6 hours, Ellie said. I'm motivated. Another silence. We will withdraw pending council review, the commander said at last. The challenger's trial status is suspended, not forfeit. This is unprecedented. You understand what you have done. I understand that a person who is trying to honor his brother deserves a chance to finish what he started, she said. I hope your council agrees. The channel closed. She turned around and found Corvin standing in the doorway to the bridge. She did not know how long he had been there. She did not know which part he had heard. He looked at her for a long time, and the bioluminescent filaments along his neck and jaw were moving in a pattern she had not seen before. Not the slow rhythm of processing or the flickering distress of pain, but something sustained and warm, a slow pulse that moved from the base of his throat upward, like something being offered to the surface from somewhere deep. "You read the Codex," he said. "I'm a xenologist. You read it for me." She didn't answer that because the answer was obvious and they both knew it, and saying it out loud would change the texture of the room in ways she wasn't sure she was prepared to navigate. "Will the council rule in your favor?" she asked instead. "I do not know." He crossed the bridge slowly, came to stand beside her at the viewport, and looked out at the stars, at Kithra's moon system still visible in the distance, at the debris field that had nearly killed him and instead had brought him here. "I know that I am alive. I know that this is because of you. I know that in the accounting of my people, I am supposed to count this as a debt or a shame or a complication." He paused. "I find I cannot." "What do you count it as?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. The stars drifted. "When I was a child," he said, "my brother told me that the Vethkar was not about proving worth to the council. He said it was about learning what you were made of when everything else was stripped away." He turned and looked at her with all four eyes, and in the low light of the bridge, his bioluminescence was steady, clear, unhurried. "I think I have learned something about what I am made of. I think it surprised me." Ellie looked back at him and thought about 11 years in the dark between stars, about the distances she had chosen over warmth, about all the questions she had chased that turned out to be approximations of the one question she had never thought to ask directly. She thought about a distress beacon that hadn't sounded like a malfunction. She thought about how she'd known, even then, before she crossed the airlock, before she saw the broken ship and the kneeling figure inside it, that whatever was broadcasting on that frequency was doing so not because it was broken, but because something in it had not yet decided to stop. "Some signals," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "You just have to answer." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Across every cultural distance, across the entire impossible breadth of what they were to each other, and what they were not, and what they might become, something had been transmitted and something had been received, and neither of them could claim any more that they had not understood. The meridian drifted on. Behind them, the debris field turned slowly in the dark. Ahead, a station waited with all its ordinary complications. The ritual council would deliberate. The hierarchy would file reports. Ellie's supervisor would send 17 increasingly agitated messages that she would read and then set aside. None of it had happened yet. Right now, there was only this: a human and a Vektari standing at the edge of the known world, looking out at the stars that separated them and finding, perhaps for the first time for both of them, that the distance felt smaller than it used to. Not gone, just smaller. And in the calculus of everything that had always felt impossibly far away, smaller was everything.